So I'm Louise McLaren. I'm the UK MD of a Paris-based consultancy called Lovebrands. We specialise in insight and turning that into solving a range of problems that normally come from the marketing department of typically large corporates we work with. So it could be developing a new brand positioning, it could be a category strategy, it could be some innovation work, it could be solving a problem, like answer a question like, we're not selling as much as we think we should do of this product. Why? Or we think there's an opportunity here, but we don't know what form it takes. What does that look like? So that's broadly what I do, and I'll explain more about that in a minute. And when I talk about insight, it's both here I'm talking about both the practice and the content that's being delivered. So normally in large corporates, that's commissioned by insight, or large organizations. There are insight specialists. They might work in insight teams. They might be distributed across product lines, for example, and they work with stakeholders in different functions like marketing, design, brand roles, and then they're leveraging a range of inputs, which could be classified as research or insight. So surveys, analytics of the business's data, analytics of sales data, or sort of other data sources, interviews, focus groups, workshops, ethnography, online platforms and communities, and reviewing cultural trends. So there's a really wide range of sources of insight that are typically leveraged. And through using those methods, we can better understand our target market and, really importantly, the context that's around them, that's informing how they feel and how they behave, in order to address a wide range of challenges, such as the ones I've just described. We think there's an opportunity in this kind of benefit space. We just don't know what it looks like. Our brands are underperforming. We don't know why. Or we have a strategy at the top level. Maybe it's a sustainability strategy, but we don't know how to make that actionable at a category level, at a brand level, at a product level. We don't know how to communicate it. We don't know what's relevant to develop in terms of products and messages for consumers. So those are the kinds of things that we might tackle. And so then I'm sort of in my sort of typical kind of seeing myself back and being a student. This is the question I've set: how do I define the problem? I've talked about insight. What do I mean when I talk about the fact the world is turbulent? Well, I think we probably don't need to dwell too much on that. I'm going to hazard a guess that we're not going to disagree that the world at least feels turbulent these days. The term permacrisis went into the dictionary recently, and I can't be the only one here, I would guess, who feels like the world is around us as a bit of a rolling set of crises. Some might flare up quite briefly as sort of acute threats, but might highlight quite endemic, intractable problems underneath them, like the concern that we are having about energy blackouts in the UK this winter, speak to energy security issues, speak to our leaky homes. And some of these crises that we experience might be sort of more episodic, but actually kind of never really go away, like COVID or Brexit. They just kind of reveal themselves in waves. And then let's not even talk about Trussonomics and the enduring impact of those 45 days. The kind of work that I do is typically commissioned by large businesses that tend to sort of have insight really embedded in their processes. If they're going to be doing a new brand positioning, if they're going to be developing new products, category work, they know that they need to ground that in insight. They know they can't just sort of figure out what the need is by thinking internally. But of course, budgets are getting squeezed. And so I don't expect that I'm going to hear much direct sentiment that the world is becoming so turbulent, there's no value in looking at data, in speaking to people, in using diverse sources of insight and understanding to make sense of the people we're targeting and what's going on in the world around us. But I do expect that this sense of turbulence and change, and this sense of one crisis after another and colliding crises that we're experiencing these days, are going to create some new challenges and should create some points for reflection for us around what does insight look like today, and what should it look like, and how does it need to behave in this context. And one challenge that I think we'll see more and more is that the idea that insight will quickly become redundant, because its shelf life is going to be seen as shorter because of this turbulent context around us. So maybe how we understand people's attitudes at one point in time might not be relevant in a year. And a case in point is that I did a project during COVID. We ran the fieldwork in summer 2021, and it was with the Purpose Disruptors, who you may be familiar with. And it was a project called the Good Life 2030. And it was looking to understand, what do people want from life, projecting ahead to 2030, far enough that they wouldn't expect their lives to be exactly the same as it is now, but far enough ahead that they can sort of imagine what that would look like to them, and what values would they look to see kind of coming through in their lives at that point in the future. And the challenge that we get now, as we're talking about what we learned in that insight, is it still valid in late 2022 when we've had all these things, kind of when you stop and think about all the things that have happened in a year and a half, all these things that have happened within the UK and more globally, come to sort of confront us and challenge us, and sort of new priorities potentially coming on stream in our lifestyles. Is what we learned still valid? And we would say yes, because the insight was really rooted in endemic values that don't shift much over time. And COVID gave us cause and time and headspace to reflect on those values. And it's not like COVID's gone away. And it's also triggered some enduring lifestyle shifts for many people. But we have to recognize that in that study, shifts in our context might put a different complexion on the insight now, because the work was so focused on how we see our relationships to societies and to the world around us. So some findings might be amplified. They've not gone away. The insight isn't relevant, but it might actually be even more important, or some might have a different nuance. So in that case, we found a way to revisit the research and sort of sense check its enduring validity and refresh it for the now. And within that, I think there's a kind of a useful potential point that which is a sort of constructive pushback on the idea that insight's shelf life shortens because the world is so fast changing. And that's because our values don't change that fast. And I've seen some really interesting Ipsos data on this, and I can find that study. And there are others that I've seen as well. I can circulate some reference points, which is basically showing that values don't shift that much across generations. We tend to think that what really matters to us and drives our behaviors fundamentally is changing more by generation than it is. And then the other argument I'd make is that businesses are typically going to be addressing needs that aren't fleeting, that aren't just kind of a fleeting passing trend that are prompted by circumstances. Normally they're addressing needs that have some kind of enduring nature to them and some stability to them, because that creates a business opportunity that you can sort of go after. And so, if we can sensibly look around us and say, in the current economic and political climate, hasn't eroded all sorts of unmet needs that we have societally and as consumers and as citizens. For example, the current economic and political climate hasn't eroded women's unmet needs for better solutions to navigate the menopause. That's not gone away. Hasn't meant that we stopped worrying about climate change as a backdrop to our purchase decisions, even if our wallets are a little bit lighter than they were. But I think what that does emphasize is the importance of insight professionals to really have their finger on the pulse of the cultural context around them, to help make sensible judgment calls as to when a fresh look at a problem is truly needed. And then to support that, we can leverage all manner of research and insight that's already in the public domain. Looking at what's in the media, looking at Google Trends data, looking at reports that are published from often some of the big research agencies. There's a lot already in the public domain that can enable us to sense check what's really enduring, what's not going away, even if the world feels even more turbulent than ever. Another challenge that I think we'll hear more and more is that in this challenging, fast-changing world, people can't tell us what they need more than ever, because what they need is changing. And they're kind of perhaps dealing with so many kind of fundamental problems that they can't sort of think beyond those. And in the increasingly pressurized business context that a lot of companies, organizations are dealing with, we can expect that we might find more of a push towards decision making based on data, evidence, numbers, not qualitative insight, not trends, not a kind of a view of what's going on that's more kind of soft and instinctive, but numbers, facts. But of course, there's only so far that people can ever tell us what they need. And that's why often when we're working on some quite kind of complex business, marketing challenges, we need a triangulation of inputs anyway to identify the insight that's really going to fuel a major project like a brand positioning or product innovation. We might need to put more evidence on the selling story internally to clients, to stakeholders, but that doesn't mean that numbers, that analysing surveys and sales data and looking at omnibuses is suddenly going to give us all the answers. But I do think that the increased turbulence of the world around us should give us pause for thought around what we can do to be better prepared and how we can better anticipate what could possibly come to sort of confront us in our work. And so we could better see risks and opportunities ahead of competitors and not to have our judgment clouded by the series of crises that hit us. And the first, I think, is going to be really about being tapped into culture, because when we pay really close attention to the signals around us, the signs that there are enduring unmet needs, that there are growing unmet needs, that, for example, tighter funding of the NHS or education in this country, for example, is going to push more people into having unmet needs that they need to address in the private sector, for example. When we see growing issues or shifts of sentiment on a topic, and we can observe a lot of that through just paying attention to what we can see in the media and blogs on social media, we can better identify those opportunities that are growing and those risks that won't go away, because we're seeing enough evidence over time. We're seeing the patterns emerging. We're seeing how needs and issues are growing. Another is just getting out into the real world. Unfortunately, in this country, we have widening health and income inequalities, and there's a growing percentage of the population that are living in poverty. And the danger is that sometimes in marketing, we can be in a bit of a London bubble or a southwest East England bubble, and we don't necessarily live the lives that people who large chunks of the population are living, and it risks becoming harder and harder for us to relate to what they're going through, because the difference that is becoming more stark between our experiences and what people living in poverty are experiencing. And we might feel sympathy, but how much can we really understand? So I think it's imperative that we engage with the societal issues around us however we can, and how they're manifesting in real life. And because even if we're not directly as marketers working with people who are living in poverty or who are dealing with some of the issues that we're going to see growing in society, it's affecting everyone around us in direct and indirect ways. It could be the fear, the anxiety, it could be anxiety about what kind of experience you're going to get if you go to your doctor. It could be anxiety about what's going to happen if you lose your job. It could play into how you manage your money within the bank. It could play into decisions that you make in all sorts of consumer categories. And it's the concerns about what we're vulnerable to if just a few things go wrong. So I think sort of looking at what's going on widely in society can help us really understand some of those shifts in attitudes and needs and concerns that can sort of start to cascade when people feel more anxious and more vulnerable. And I think we take a step back too and sort of think about how people are sort of moving down Maslow's hierarchy of needs at the moment. And, thinking in marketing, we sometimes talk about how we're architects of desire, especially in the advertising space. People sometimes need escapism, and aspiration can be a part of marketing, but we've got to be really sensitive, I think, to in these challenging times, to whether the messages that we're communicating are appropriate to what's going on around us today, what's going on in society. What might have felt appropriate and suitable before the economy started the decline it's in now might just not feel appropriate now. And sometimes we just got to use our instinct there and make sure we ask ourselves the question. But again, just being connected into that cultural context will better enable us to do that. And then lastly, I think we have to embrace uncertainty, and we need to recognize that we can't predict the future at a certain point. There's a saying that a trend is only a trend until it bends, and the unexpected factors can come and sort of shake our context up. And that's where I think there's huge value in methods and tools and disciplines to imagine different possible futures. And I have a I put a lot of value in scenario planning in that respect, helping us to imagine different plausible futures that aren't linear trajectories from where we are now, because typically we're bad at predicting the future, or the signals are there and we don't listen to them. So we need to listen to the signals, which goes back to paying attention to what's going on in culture. But then we need to sort of think about how some of these signals that we're picking up can potentially come together and shape different plausible futures for our businesses, for our organizations, for our brands. And then we can better anticipate what those scenarios could mean for our businesses, and then ensure we're more resilient to what may come. But that's kind of getting into scenario planning is a whole other talk, which is for another time. But that's my last point, really, about sort of thinking, sort of embracing that uncertainty, recognizing that we can't predict, while trying to be attuned to the signals of change, trying to be attuned to the signs that there are unmet needs, that there are growing needs, and then leveraging methods, tools to imagine into the future so that we're better prepared for whatever may come.